Get going. Welcome everyone to this session as part of the Insight 2020 festival. The whole of the festival, all 6 weeks of it, have been dedicated to looking at the role of research and analysis in the decision-making process. And this final week of the festival is themed very much on decision quality. This is the penultimate event, this is the penultimate session. There's just one more session left to go, which is tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock, which is a panel session which features Daniel Ohm, Sally Warren, Paul Maubach and Andy Williams. And they're going to be looking at the sort of not particularly contained topic of decision making. What next? You know, where's it all going to go? So they'll be rounding off the festival by attempting to pull that little lot together. So if you're interested in that, I very much advise you to register for that. Al, if you could just pop onto the next slide, I'll just do a bit of housekeeping for the session. If you could go down.
I can't advance.
I'll attempt to do this from memory whilst you do it then. But if, I mean, the basic housekeeping would be if people could keep their microphones on mute through the session, that would be really helpful. We'd like to minimize ambient noise and maximize the amount that we can hear from Al. I'll encourage you all the way through, please, to use the chat box to send questions through to Al. I've got a few questions for him, but I want to also encourage your participation and to take some questions from you as we go. I also want to encourage you to tweet about the event and to tweet your feelings and your findings from today's session. We're strategy_unit on Twitter, and the hashtag for the event is #Insight2020. Just whilst you're doing that, Al, I also just wanted to say a few words to introduce you to introduce people in the audience to you if they don't know you. Whilst I was doing that, I was trying to think of ways in which I thought I could legitimately describe you. Ways in which I know you and terms I thought I could usefully use. The terms I came up with, I mean, I know you as a clinician, so I know you from meeting you that you have a background in clinical care, background as a clinician, but I also know that whilst you were doing your training for that, you also got an interest in economics, so I know you as an economist. I think over time I came to think of you actually as having a strand to your thought as a community organizer almost. So I have you as a clinician, I have you as a researcher, an economist, someone interested in community organising. And then I think last week or the week before, you outed yourself as a trainee steel worker as well, trainee iron worker. So a man with many angles to you. I mean, the only other thing I wanted to say by way of introduction for people who are perhaps new to your thinking is that I would say you're the subtlest thinker that I've had the pleasure to work with. And there are many, many things I heard you say actually several years ago that I'm still getting things from. There's a lot of richness, I think, in your thought and the way that you present things, such that my expectation for this session is that some of this is going to resonate immediately with people. Other bits are going to turn the head upside down and will need a little bit of thinking through for people. So that's certainly been my experience of being in sessions like this with you over the years. So I've massively inflated expectations now, so you can curse me for that, but I'll just hand over to you. So if you present for sort of half an hour, 40 minutes or so, and then we'll take some questions after that.
Well, thank you very much, Fraser, for that warm personal introduction. I appreciate it very much. And you haven't inflated expectations, but that's okay. What I want to be sure of, though, is that we have an opportunity to have as much of a conversation as we can in this pandemic time mode of communicating. And I do have a fair number of slides because I wanted to be able to make some points pretty quickly, but I have no need to use the slides. So Fraser, if you want to monitor the chat and interrupt at any time, please do. And I may end up just going through some slides quickly, and I hope that doesn't offend you because I want to rush to get to the discussion time. But let's begin with some things I learned from a session that I didn't get to see, but did get to see the slides and the Mentimeter output. This was a session done by Muhammad and Lucy Hawkins last Friday. And the title of it was An Introduction to Decision Quality. I don't know how many of you listening now were part of that conversation, but I just want to give you a sense of the response to this question. Which have you seen occur in your place of work? Hidden agendas, strong beliefs in spite of the evidence, seldom having well thought out alternatives when making decisions, and advocacy for a particular idea rather than an impartial judgment about the decision being made. And here are some others. Lack of clarity about who has the authority and responsibility for making the decision, not committing resources at the time, so is it really a decision? Tolerating dysfunctional behaviors within the decision-making process, no standard for judging the quality of a decision, and everything has to go through the office of the president, and it gets stuck there for weeks. Now, when I look at that, it appears to me that most of the participants responding, excuse me, most of the participants responding were thinking about decisions made within and by groups of people working in organizations with more or less, particularly in a situation like the NHS working with the Department of Health, with more or less political engagement. And I'll make the distinction between organizational behavior and political process in a moment. But what interested me the most was this word cloud, which responded to what three words come to mind when you hear decision quality. As I look at that, I see a dominance of evidence. It looks to me like three of the six most frequent things that came to mind were about evidence-based and the importance of evidence. One of the things that I'm going to be saying to you comes from what Fraser described as my sort of hybrid training. I did decide in 1968, when I was still an undergraduate at Dartmouth, that I would only go to medical school where I could study economics while studying medicine and not be viewed as too subversive by the medical faculty. And I ended up doing that at Harvard, was privileged enough to be in the third class of the new PhD program in public policy, which was designed by economists and a couple of political scientists as well. And I did that because I thought I would want to have a career in policy. But by the time I actually got there, I had fallen in love with clinical medicine. So my ambition all of a sudden shifted. It was, how could I use what I learned from economists to improve clinical practice? And one of the things I learned was from Howard Rafer. Howard Rafer was the East Coast, the Harvard professor, working with Ron Howard across the continent at Stanford in the development of decision analysis in the early days of decision analysis. And I learned from him about expected value decision making, where you need to know what the alternatives are. You need to work really hard to get the evidence to understand what the probabilities of different outcomes might be if you choose one alternative or the other. But you also had to work really hard at something much more difficult because it was so subjective, which is how good or bad are the outcomes? And especially, how good or bad are they for the person or people who live with the consequences when you're in the role of making the decision on their behalf, or you're in the role of making a decision that has an impact on lots of people. The second thing I learned from an economist was from Tom Schelling. And what I learned from Tom was, and he was the father of game theory, what I learned from Tom is that rarely can you make and implement a consequential decision by yourself. You often need an agent who has greater expertise than you do about the subject matter. If the decision is to have surgery, you can't do the surgery yourself, right? I mean, this is obvious when you say it, but you put those two things together and carry it around for a bit as a clinician. And there's going to be a moment when there's an epiphany, and I'm very briefly going to tell you my moment. I was attending physician in the intensive treatment unit at Massachusetts General Hospital, having been on the staff, having trained there, having been on the staff for about 3 years. And I was also doing research in intensive care. And I was coming back from a family meeting. We'll call the patient Mrs. Jones. And it was day 9 after she had been nasotracheally intubated, and the clinicians, the few clinicians on, understand that that meant we had to make a decision about whether to continue to use artificial ventilatory support for this woman with probably end-stage chronic pulmonary disease. And as I was walking back after a really good family meeting, able to communicate with her family, I was proud of my students, proud of my residents. The epiphany was, I have about maybe 100 patients like that in the database so far. And I was thinking, how could I narrow the confidence intervals around the probability of her having survived if we did do a tracheotomy and continue ventilatory support? And all of a sudden I realized, based on what I'd learned from Howard Rafa, that the decision wasn't going to be sensitive to the probability. It didn't matter whether it was 1 in 50, 1 in 500, 1 in 5,000 that she would survive, because it was so sensitive to how she and her family felt about where, when, and how she was going to die. And that's what the economists would call the utility or the disutility at the end of the decision tree. And that moment was the first time I made the distinction between unwarranted variation, when we haven't brought the evidence to bear to narrow the confidence intervals to reduce uncertainty as much as possible, and warranted variation, where Mrs. Jones and her family might feel quite different than Mr. Smith and his across the hall. Okay. So I'm telling you that story just so you can understand where the challenges that I'm going to put forward, just some of the assumptions that are evident in this word cloud come from. Okay? Now, I've never done this before. This is the first time I've used this slide, and it came from conversations that I had with Fraser and Lucy and others at the strategy unit. And I basically want to argue that that word cloud reflected a focus on dialogue 2 between policymakers and system leaders and health professionals, and dialogue 3 between policymakers and system leaders and citizens and patients. And I'm going to say decision quality there is incredibly important, but it's also much more complicated and complex than it is at the base of that pyramid. There, we are reasonably close to having a rational actor with an agent as we're making decisions. Dialogue 2 is all about organizational process and how many divisions are there, and is there competition within the organization? Are the standard operating procedures old and need updating, or they work well? Dialogue 3 is about often negotiation around difficult ideologies that sort of set the priors for what the right thing to do is. We won't get into politics of your country right now, politics of my country right now, with Brexit looming and an uncomfortable transition. But I think you know what I'm talking about. So part of the argument I want to make here is, if we're going to measure decision quality, let's be sure we gather the intelligence we can from achieving higher decision quality where that is easiest to do. The professional services is there to remind me to say that often people think about service delivery as if it's a manufacturing process and there's a product to be delivered. Some really smart business people recognize long ago that the service industry is very different. The smallest replicable unit in a service industry is the person who knows how to deliver the service, the person who's going to receive it, and the bidirectional exchange of information about what is possible and what would be valued. Now, that's not just a conversation. There's a lot of technical aspects there. The use and interpretation of diagnostic tests is a good example. In order to bring the professional expertise to the table when you're making a decision. But I'm going to argue that much of that is in a black box for policymakers and system leaders. And it's in a black box because, as Bob Evans, an economist in Canada, observed in 1990 in a volume that I contributed to, Jack Wenberg contributed, Clint McPherson in the UK, Nick Black, about practice variation. He called his chapter "The Dog in the Nighttime," because as long as practice variation has been described, policymakers have never dealt with it effectively. And he was basically arguing that doctors can always put them on their heels by pointing to the scientific training they've had to assert their authority, and to the art of medicine to protect their autonomy. And as long as that black box is impervious or policymakers don't dare enter, we're not going to have policy that fully supports high quality decisions made between clinicians and patients and family. Now, why is this so important at a system level? And this is a very quick trip through history. Jack first described variation in surgical rates with Clem McPherson as the first author in the UK, Norway, US, in a medical journal, having described it before in 1982, published in the New England Journal of Medicine. Now, that was just a year after my epiphany about warranted and unwarranted variation. So I went up and introduced myself to him, and we have been working together since, leading to the Dartmouth Atlas, published first in 1996, where it was discovered that we spend 3 times as much per capita in Miami as opposed to Minneapolis, where research that followed demonstrated that with that higher intensity and cost of services, there are no better outcomes in terms of survival and function. It's more difficult for doctors with longer wait times. It's more difficult to see doctors with longer wait times. Doctors have more difficulty admitting to the hospital, and there's poor perception of quality from the patient perspective as well. That's with the higher cost and higher intensity. And the sources of waste are failure to deliver care that we know is effective safely, overuse and underuse of what we call preference-sensitive care. And if there's easily avoidable ignorance there on the part of patients about what's realistically possible, and on the part of clinicians about what patients value and the trade-offs they're willing or not willing to make, that easily avoidable ignorance is reflected in the commissioning decisions, in the capacity building decisions, in the workforce planning. Now, you probably recognize that what I'm talking about is how markets fail if there isn't some attention to the asymmetry of information at the base of that pyramid, and how states fail when they develop cost effectiveness guidelines, as in NICE, that use average risk attitudes, average utilities, rather than risk attitudes, utilities, disutilities at the level of the individual. And we only create value at the level of the individual, except for community externalities when you're dealing with a pandemic, for instance. And this isn't just a US problem, it's an international problem. You know, we've got the largest market-driven healthcare economy in the world in the US. You've got the largest tax-funded planned healthcare economy with the remarkable commitment made in 1948 to health equity. And after the NHS plan years ago, you had 3-fold variation among the 152 PCTs in per capita costs for cancer and heart disease care, with 8-fold variation in placement of stents for stable heart disease after NHS planned capacity building. So that capacity building was without the intelligence that would have come from knowing that 90% of the patients thought that a stent reduced the risk of a heart attack or sudden death, and it doesn't. Easily avoidable ignorance. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. I suspect that many of you know what a Stacy diagram is. What I want to do here is to just give you a sense of how the Stacy diagram can be thought of as a system level tool or an organizational level tool, which is the way Stacy originally envisioned it. But you can also use the 2-dimensional space to think about how we improve the quality of decisions at the level of the individual patient. Our job is to reduce uncertainty as much as possible, moving from left to right, down towards the origin on the horizontal axis. And to the extent that we do the research and manage the knowledge to get the probabilities right, we're dealing with the unwarranted variation. Our job is not to get all patients to feel the same way about the same outcome. And I've never had anybody contest that statement. And when we move over to the system, we have to recognize that this notion of autonomy and agency and caring about things and having risk attitudes is everywhere. It's part of all of our lives. And when you have decisions made by and on behalf of people in organizations, you're going to have an awful lot of end running and resistance if you try to overspecify their daily work. So you need simple rules. And the simple rules here are a service industry like the NHS should have as its strategic objective to deliver the care people need and want, no less but no more. And there should be no decision made in the face of easily avoidable ignorance. And there should always be manifest respect shown for the individual and what they care about. People don't argue with that often either. Just to make a point with a couple of examples and an illustration of how simple decision quality measurement could be if we made it a priority. How much does keeping your breast matter? The woman on the left is Ruth, the woman on the right is Tina. I interviewed both of them along with about 100 other women in Chicago when we were developing a decision aid for breast cancer decision making. And Ruth says, I knew that I might have cancer come back, but I knew my survival wouldn't be affected. And having my breast was important to me. Tina said, I knew me, I couldn't sleep at night. She wanted her breast removed. And the simple approach to decision quality measure in a case like that is to spend time with 120 women and learn what the gist is of the decision they're making. What are the essential trade-offs? And boil it down to 2 or 3 questions. 2 or 3 questions on the left to make sure that you're dealing with their understanding. Are they informed? Do they understand the probabilities that are relevant? And over on the right, do we know enough about how they feel about the outcomes? We're not asking them to become experts. We're just leaning into this from their perspective to learn a few questions to ask to make sure there's no avoidable ignorance. I'm going to choose one other example, which is the one we started with, men with lower urinary tract symptoms because of benign prostate disease. Again, these are men I got to know. The man on the right wasn't bothered by his symptoms very much because of his life circumstances. The man on the left was a construction worker. Things were very difficult for him. That's context at the level of the individual. And they both had exactly the same measured level of symptoms. We developed the International Prostate Symptom Score to demonstrate that. And over on the right, where we've got the questions about how do you feel about your symptoms, how bothered are you, and how bothered would you be by a different experience of sex where you don't ejaculate? On the bottom there, you've got these little triangles representing the outcomes at the end of the decision tree, simple decision tree. And what that OR equals 7 indicates is that men who are bothered by their current symptoms are 7 times more likely to choose surgery than men who are not bothered by the same level of symptoms. On the bottom, what you see is men who are bothered by the prospect of something they've never experienced, but in the way they imagine it, bothered by the prospect of having retrograde ejaculation, are 1/5 as likely to have surgery. That's what we call value concordance. That's what different urology groups, urology services, even PCNs should be competing on if they want to compete. Are we doing what matters for the health and well-being for the person? What I'm basically saying here is that there isn't a country in the world that doesn't struggle with the incredible waste and harm associated with underuse of things that are effective and anticipatory, and overuse of things that people wouldn't want if they were engaged and informed. And a lot of that is related to the technical role in diagnosis over on the left. We don't have a lot of time to talk about that, but certainly System 1 and System 2 processing is very relevant to the conversation about decision quality last Friday. But the point I want to make is that you also have to have very, very strong capacity built for relational skills, using things like motivational interviewing, shared decision-making, self-determination theory, basic cognitive behavioral therapy. We know all those things work. No health system has structured itself to have the time to do it well. I won't take time with this other than to say everything we're talking about is just as relevant to long-term conditions as it is to discrete decisions. The man on the top, my diet is, he's a perfect patient. You tell him to do something, he'll do it. The man on the bottom says, you know, finally, she said, you need to cheat once in a while. You're so afraid of dying because of what we've told you to do and why you're not really living. Now, a lot of people would put the man on the bottom in one of the white boxes and put the man in the top in the green box up there, highly motivated. But what's really important is to recognize that the man on the top gets maybe 6 or 7 things asked of him, and the man on the bottom gets maybe 10 or 12 things asked of him. And what we should be doing is putting the tasks in those 4 quadrants, not the people, so that we can prioritize the task and ask people to do things that they can easily do first. So we give them not only a sense of autonomy, but a sense of competence, and build trust so they have a sense of relatedness to the system that's trying to support them. And that's just shown here. This is self-determination theory, which emerged from University of Rochester following the biopsychosocial model of care. I'm going to come back to this for a moment. And this is a slide that I have used before. We've got what is possible, what is valued down in the bottom. We know what is possible based on evidence. We know what is valued based on assessment of patients' preferences. We could use some help in assuring that there's a good dialogue about that. A simple measure like collaborate. Some of you know it's just 3 questions. How much effort was made to help you understand your health issues? How much effort was made to listen carefully to learn what matters to you? How much effort was made to consider what matters to you in planning the next step in your care? And we could have commissioners assuring that that kind of dialogue happened. And therefore enforcing not a contract, but a compact, because health professionals agreed that those are important questions. And then we'd have a sense that these were high quality decisions. And the high quality decisions would really inform commissioning. You didn't need to build all those cath labs to do the stents if only you knew that 90% of the people being stented were misinformed. Now, the reason I argued that the base of the pyramid is where we should be focusing is there's only one interdependency there. In its simplest form, there's a clinician that the patient trusts to act as their agent. There's the patient who will go back and report to family perhaps, but it's just a one-on-one dialogue at the moment. There's one interdependency. Neither can make and implement a good decision alone, whether it's a discrete surgical intervention or whether it's management of 3 long-term conditions that the person is dealing with. And that's at the origin of this. Notice that the vertical axis here is number of stakeholders interdependencies. And that's a proxy for the kind of complexity that Stacy talks about. So why not focus down at that origin and work really hard to make sure there's no avoidable ignorance there so we can capture the critical intelligence that comes from the informed choices that people make when they're engaged. And this is just to segue back over to dialogue 2 and dialogue 3, and just to remind you of the understanding complexity at the level of the system with those simple rules that I described earlier, and show you 2 other versions of that. Here, this is from Stacy, but I got it off the GP training web from the Royal College of General Practitioners. You can see down below. And down at the origin, they're talking about rational decision making. And as you move up the vertical axis, they're talking about political decision making, because the complicatedness or the emerging complexity is largely about valuing different things, like entrepreneurship in the free market versus solidarity. So that's why it's political decision making. And over on the right, they call it judgmental. You see, I even went to the trouble of changing the term. You're moving more towards decisions where there are lots of people in the organization who might have different attitudes towards the risk that remains after uncertainty has been reduced as much as it can. And they have different views of how good or bad things are. Okay, so over on the left, that little green shaded area is what I would characterize as the dialogue 3, while the horizontal one is the dialogue 2. And here's another slide that is a version of this that I thought worth including. It's the rational decision-making down below with a focus on monitoring. And I'm talking about monitoring the quality of those decisions, no avoidable ignorance. Organizational decision-making to its right. There it says the focus is on a desired future, because you can get people to rally around a vision, even if they don't agree with the decision at hand. And that's why the simple rules are so important. You know, a vision of the care they need and want, no less but no more, no avoidable ignorance, and manifest respect among the people who are related to each other in making the decision. And then the political decision is all about negotiation. And haven't seen enough of that in my country, and perhaps not in yours as well. The reason I wanted to show this as well is that fourth, complexity is your friend rather than an enemy if you lean into it in the way I tried to do with the prior slide showing the mutual accountability between people at the front lines and system leaders. That's where the learning happens, and that's where the creativity emerges. And again, collaborate is an obvious tool for clinicians to hold themselves accountable. I've yet to find a clinician. I'll tell you a story. Donald Collins. There's a paper published in BMJ that contains a lot of this thinking. March 30th, 2017. And there's a little audio that came with it. I just rediscovered it yesterday because of a course that I'm teaching next week here at Dartmouth. And Donald is on that. And when we first introduced Collaborate to 4 MCPs and 2 PACs that we were working with at the behest of the new care models team for 6 Vanguards, we pointed out that when Collaborate was used in the northwest of England across different services, and you set a high bar and said, we want scores of 999 on a 0 to 9 scale for those 3 questions. The proportion of patients giving different consultants 999 ranged from 4% to 96%. And somebody from CSU raised their hand and said, boy, if you could get such a low score, I'm not sure I would want to subject my GPs to the kind of shame that would elicit. And Donald Collins shot his hand up and said, I want to know. And we said, Donald, we're glad you'd want to know because we'd want to help you get to 98 as quickly as possible. So I tell you that story just because if you give people tools that allow them to take a first credible step in the direction of a change that they're committed to see happening over time, and then each of the tools along the way to the right are all decision quality support tools for the middle managers, for the commissioners, all the way up to Richmond House number 10 and number 11. Okay. I don't know if you have this Mentimeter built in, but I was really curious what 3 words come to mind when you hear decision quality now? But we can just have an open discussion.
I've got a couple of questions for you, Alan. Then should we do that Mentimeter? Look, thank you ever so much for running that through, and also thank you very much. I mean, just for bringing all of. I know there's a sort of collection of your thoughts that you brought together in that session. So thank you ever so much for doing that and structuring it so well. I've got some questions. One based primarily on the fact that we have a collection of analysts in the audience. The strategy interest, of course, is an analytical interest in this agenda. And you said in relation to the black box of medicine, or the black box of the process between clinician and citizen, that policymakers sort of struggled to get into it. Well, I'm wondering then if analysts could get into it and could start to expose some of the decision quality that you've described in empirical terms and in describable empirical terms. You mentioned a few tools in doing that. In a sense, I suppose my question is, what's the agenda that you would set for the analyst community in looking at decision quality?
Well, I think there's a broad agenda for analysts, and my use of decision analysis before the epiphany I had was largely focused on cost effectiveness analysis. It wasn't until I met Mrs. Jones and her family that I recognized that they rely on average responses to questions about utilities and average responses to questions about risk. And that could easily lead to giving interventions to people who wouldn't choose them more often than you withhold them from people who would, because the cost effectiveness analysis itself is kind of an endorsement of giving it. So, and I'm sure that applies to NICE, and I've had many conversations with leaders of NICE, most recently over a long period of time with David Haslam. So cost effectiveness, operations research, some of the examples that Mohammed and Lucy used on Friday came from operations research. All of that improves decision quality. The point that I'm trying to make is that because it is the least complex, because there's this one interdependency, focusing on decision quality at the front lines about what interventions are going to be used and what interventions are not going to be used is an incredibly underexplored area. And it, you know, to my mind, it raises the question for analysts: do you feel uncomfortable opening up that black box, as I think policymakers do? What policymakers can focus on are what I would refer to as the system functions. They hear from constituents that they are not happy with access. They hear from constituents that they're not happy with continuity. They don't want to see somebody other than their GP. They hear from constituents that, et cetera, et cetera. Those are the system functions. And in your country and in my country in the 1990s, added on to those system functions was the gatekeeper function, which builds a bit of a barrier between patients and citizens and the clinicians. It puts clinicians in a role that they didn't train to be in. They trained to be a gateway for good care and good decisions, not gatekeepers. So I'm going on too long, but for me, the question to analysts is what could they not do, given the skills they have, if they were willing to step into this, this hypothesis that we can generate lots of analytic tools to deal with unwarranted variation that relate to the system functions, but also that relate to the presentation of evidence that define the probabilities of outcomes. We are likely not to get a lot of traction with policymakers if we try to measure patients' preferences, because it's nothing other than an opinion, one that changes over time with experience. It's just too subjective. But what if we make sure that the choice they make is informed by the evidence and consistent with their preferences? Because then the actual intervention used is objective. And you've got that objective data heading back up to commissioners and Health Education England, et cetera. So that's the challenge.
That's great. I was going to ask you to elaborate on that, and you've started to do it. So a world in which there were many more measures of decision quality around, there was a lot more data, a lot more metrics, measure of decision quality within the system. We could look at different PCNs, different clinicians could look at how would this world be different? What would this world look like? Commissioners would have a sense of how good or bad decision quality was in their areas. They might have areas where they could help to improve it, or patients might be selecting their GP practice according to this. Did you say a little bit more about the implications of that kind of thing?
Well, let me start from the policymakers' perspective, and including the commissioning functions. I would argue that they would have the critical intelligence. And now you couldn't do this all at once. You couldn't improve decision quality across the system all at once. You would have to set some priorities for what would be the most credible areas in which we would measure decision quality in ways that would likely affect utilization rates. So where can we tackle underuse and overuse by measuring decision quality and making that intelligence widely known? And maybe we would want to start off in a high rate area and a low rate area of hip replacement, just as an example. We know that from work done in Canada, that if you identify patients who are perfect candidates by all clinical criteria, including NICE, for a hip replacement, you would get a rate higher than any of the 306 rates in the Dartmouth Atlas of Healthcare without shared decision-making. If you engage them in shared decision-making, the rate extrapolated from the Canadian study would be lower than any of the 306. So there's a priority area where you could lean in and measure the decision quality. Does the person know that they're not going to be able to kneel to garden? Does the person know how long the recuperative period is? Does the clinician know that what really brought them to the GP, who only had time to do a consult rather than spend a lot of time to hear their story, does the consultant know, who's putting them on the waiting list, that they went in because their banister broke and they couldn't get down the stairs to talk to the postman every morning, and that just made them more lonely? That's so what you would be looking for, Fraser, is decrease in overuse, increase in services that are underused, including those that require the integration of primary with acute, mental with physical, and health with social, including people who can repair the banisters.
That's great. Thank you, Al. One strong temptation I have here is to just ask you a load of questions about the US election. I'm kind of not going to do that, and yet I'm going to come sort of vaguely close to it, or I'm going to do it tangentially. In the chat box, Joe Ellens, who actually does a lot of work in this area and who I would describe as an expert in shared decision making, asks a question that I got in mind about situations in which the individual might actually be badly informed, perhaps because the sort of information ecology in which they're in is kind of polluted in a way. She gives the example of anti-vaxxers, which I guess is soon to become a profoundly topical question. So what would you do? I mean, how would that play out in the circumstance where individual preferences are actually really quite badly vaccines would be a classic example, where individual preferences conflict with what would be good collectively. So if as an individual, I felt like my risk profile would mean that I wouldn't have the vaccine because I'm scared of it for whatever reason, and yet herd immunity would require that I do. So two questions. One, I guess, is about avoidable ignorance of the individuals on the way into that discussion, and then the other is about the conflict between individual preference and a good collective outcome.
Both complex questions. My partner in the Dartmouth work and my partner personally just read a book called Stuck. I haven't read it yet, and it's about anti-vaxxers. And not surprisingly, one of the points that she has described to me, and I may be getting this wrong, I usually have her at my side, is that no approach is going to be successful unless it recognizes how much of the anti-vaxxers' motivation is to push back against authority. And this does bring us into the politics of Brexit and the politics of Trump. My diagnosis, at least of the American situation, is that there were so many people in the hollowed out industrial and mining communities of America who felt looked down upon, whose choices had been so constrained by their local context and their personal context that they felt that their choices didn't matter. So a lot of those votes were just a push, not just against elites, but about scientific authority. And we've seen that play out over the course of the pandemic. So that self-determination theory that I referred to earlier, remember, it was about recognizing autonomy, helping people gain the competence to have confidence to make good decisions. And the third, and often neglected, is a sense of relatedness. Right? And it's the relatedness that moves over into the what about the collective well-being, right? So you know, if I were advising people who are worried about uptake of vaccine in the US or the UK, at one very practical level, I would say go to school on self-determination theory. You know, get a sense of what those conversations should be like, and don't think of yourself as delivering vaccination in a one-size-fits-all way. You're going to have many people hungry for it, wanting it, and just do it, deliver it. But have some way to identify those who are resistant and give them a different pathway that is about recognizing their autonomy in a positive way, making them feel competent to make the decision, and also trying to do it with relatedness. The work we've done in the Black country, as you know, Fraser, has largely been how do you recruit people from the communities where that kind of misinformation, disinformation may spread, who are clever, who have really good relational skills, and then design in a further education college a program that effectively recruits them, trains them in motivational interviewing, cognitive behavioral therapy, shared decision making, apprentices them, certifies them. So you dramatically expand the capacity within a PCN or a fully integrated community front end to have those conversations.
That's great. Thank you for taking those questions on. They were horrendous. I was conscious of that as I was giving them to you.
Just let me say something. You know, at some point, you get to a point where you have that conversation, and if there are still people who are going to put other people at risk, obviously you have to find a way to quote unquote wall them off. Doesn't sound right, but you have to find a way to recognize the incredibly negative externality when we're talking about a pandemic, right, of their decision, and tell them they can't do it, or define the things that they can't do if they choose not to be vaccinated. So I'm not unrealistic. I'm not unrealistic about how often what I propose with self-determination theory might fail.
Oh no, but in your response, there was a lot of what I really like in your thinking. Your first response was not a sort of technocratic, well, tell the plebs what's good for them and do it to them. It was a sense of, well, understand where people are coming from, go at it with a sense of relatedness, think about their position as part of a collective and work with that. Don't just think by browbeating them with the science or whatever it might be that you would correct their deficiencies. Which I agree. I think that does underlay a whole load of the politics that we've seen in our respective countries. We don't have long, and I could talk to you all afternoon. I do want to get that sort of final Mentimeter question in. But can I just ask you a quick one? Could you just pop back up? You know the slide with the three conversations where it's sort of described together, because I just want to ask you quickly about some of the major relations you see between the three, because you've set it out as three and described it in sort of three chunks and three conversations, and yet of course there must be relationships between those three different conversations. You know, maybe pick one or two of the most important relationships between those three conversations that you see.
Well, first of all, this is an incredible simplification. And again, this is the first time I've talked about this in this way. So it'll be very different after I see the work out. if I have the opportunity to do it tomorrow, I'll be learning from you all. But you know, organizational process is a gross simplification of what we're talking about. Because there, you know, within the NHS, think how many organizations there are, and there are organizations competing with one another, et cetera. And governmental politics is also a gross distinction. The reason I was using these terms is that I mentioned that there were economists, and I named two of them. Graham Allison and Dick Neustadt were the two political scientists who designed the public policy program at Harvard. back in the early 70s. And Dick Neustadt wrote something called Presidential Power, and he had been chief of staff for Truman. And his argument was, because of the role of governmental politics, presidential power is nothing more than the power to persuade. Allison took that in a very different direction, and he wrote a book called Essence of Decision. And it was a history lesson about the Cuban Missile Crisis. And he was arguing how often people make a mistake in holding on to a rational actor model when they're trying to interpret what comes out of the State Department, the organizational processes on the one hand, and the political judgments being made by, in this case, Kennedy and Khrushchev. Right? So that's why I chose the dialogue 1, dialogue 2, and dialogue 3. Now, the reason I think I'm excited about exploring this myself and with others is because the question is, to what extent does dialogue 2 support or constrain decision quality in dialogue 1? And to what extent does dialogue 3, that's the governmental politics, support or constrain decision quality in dialogue 2 and dialogue 1? And an example that I would cite, going back to the gatekeeper role as opposed to the gateway role. Just think about how different that language is. Do you want to see a gatekeeper, or do you want to see a trusted professional who is the gateway to good decisions that reflect what matters for your health and well-being? Right? And there's so much in the governmental politics side that overpromises. There's so much on the organizational process side that reinforces the threat of withholding and rationing. The rationing dynamic in the NHS is I think, a large component of your overuse problem. Our overuse problem is exploitation of the asymmetry of information, exploitation of market failure. Every time, remember I mentioned earlier, nice guidance would have you giving interventions to people who wouldn't choose them if they were well-informed more often than you withhold the same intervention from people who would. That's a gross overstatement, but I could come up with 3 or 4 examples where you would agree readily. Every time you do withhold it from somebody who would want it, what does it do? It stokes up fear of rationing. So you've got, that's part of the dialogue over there on the left. That's part of dialogue 3. How much are we willing to spend? Are we getting good taxpayer value? Is it going to be available to me? So I think, I'm repeating myself. I'm talking to myself. the notion that dialogues 2 and 3 have a profound influence on what happens in the black box suggests to me that analysts and policymakers ought to learn more about what goes on in it.
That's excellent. And throughout this session, I've really valued your concentration on that conversation at the bottom and the unpacking of it. I do want to just let us see if, we didn't set you up to try and change minds, and yet we have got a little question for people at the end on Menti, and we can contrast it with the word cloud that you showed to start off with. Let me see if I can do this. Make a pig's ear of it. But if people could go on to Mentimeter, and just the question we have is, what 3 words come to mind when you hear decision quality? 13 people have added, but I wonder if others that haven't could go to Menti, put in 31, 56, 12, 4, and see if we have any change between this word cloud and the one that we had before. Now we have choice, we have perspectives, situational influence, preference, valued, equity, knowledge, limitations, wise, personalized. Al, do you feel like your work here is done?
Yeah, no, well, I feel like I will learn from this. So if anybody hasn't added their 3 words, please do. I'm pleased to see evidence evidence bracketed by context, informed, equity, understanding, situational influence, choice. Yes. What about you? What do you think, Fraser?
Well, no, I just think, I mean, there's if you put the first word cloud next to the second one is much more nuanced, is more context specific, is much more careful, has got a whole load more about sort of value and preference within it. So I sort of feel that if we compared the two, in fact, what I'd like to do is to get you and Mohammed to have a conversation. We should put on a session where the two of you get to talk this through. But for now, I'm super conscious of time. So I want to, on behalf of everyone that's attended, on behalf of the unit and on behalf of the Insight 2020 Festival, thank you ever so much, Al, for putting the session on for us. I mean, certainly I think through all of the sessions and then, you know, culminating to an extent in a lot of what you've covered, I think we really have advanced a sense of what a good quality decision would look like and the role of the analyst and the researcher in that equation. So thank you ever so much, and thank you everyone for attending. And just to say, there's a session tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock looking at what next for decision making. So if you'd like to register for that, please just go onto our Twitter feed or the Decision Support Unit website, and you can find all the details to register there. So thank you very much, everyone.
Let me just add my thanks to all of you. Thanks for attending. This has been a pleasure and privilege. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Al.